Come on, people outside, get in, settle down. This is not the way Scott speaks, I know. He's so gentle, and I'm so abrasive, but you won't have to put up with me very long. I'm just here to introduce, and it's my great pleasure to introduce, the chairman of the board of directors of the Land Institute, Angus Wright. It is my pleasure, it's also, I should say, my honor, but at this stage of my life, I've given up on honor. I'll settle for pleasure. We're talking about the chairman of the board on Waterwell Road, which means something different from New York, Los Angeles, etc. This is a different world, it's a different board, and it's certainly a different chairman of the board. I've been on the board of the Land Institute for about 25 years. I think Angus is the best we've had in 25 years as chairman, and that includes some years I spent on the board futilely trying to figure out what the hell was going on. It includes some very good chairs over the year, but I think Angus is pretty much the ideal person, and I think you can have a great deal of confidence in the board knowing more about him as chair of the board. What do I mean when I say pretty much an ideal person? Well, if you were going to advertise, I think he meets most of the fundamental requirements, and then I'll add a few. He comes from local roots. He grew up here in Salina, the son of Howard and Thelma Wright, longtime social activist and gadflies in this community. And yet, Angus is more than just a local boy made good. He's an international traveler and observer who has thought about issues far beyond the borders of this town and state. He is a man of advanced education, degrees from the University of Kansas, PhD from the University of Michigan, where he majored in Latin American history, particularly the history of Brazil, which remains one of his great passions. He's an accomplished writer and scholar, widely respected as a Latin Americanist, as an environmental historian. The author, I just saw somebody getting their copy signed of a book, Inherit the Earth, on the landless workers movement in Brazil. And my favorite of all of his writings, I think a genuine classic that I can recommend to all of you over the long winter nights to read. It's a long book, but a wonderful book to read, The Death of Ramon Gonzalez. I'll tell you, it's a murder mystery. What killed Ramon Gonzalez is where the book starts, but it leads us, as the subtitle suggests, into, grandly phrased, the modern agricultural dilemma that confronts all of us. That book was published in 1990. It's available in an expanded edition in 2003. More about Angus. He has a thorough knowledge, believe me, of the research program, the science program here at the Land Institute. He's been with our scientists in many, many conferences and before foundations representing this institution. And yet, perhaps more than any of the rest of us, he puts that knowledge in a broader context of global agriculture, of farmers from all over the world, of the processes of social change. Angus, I think, deeply believes in the mission of the Land Institute. But he's more than a missionary. He is a man of due process. And I want to talk about process, which John Cobb eloquently defined a little while ago, but I'm going to talk about it on something less than the level of process theology and Whitehead. I mean simply that Angus believes in getting the social process on the board and in the community right. He's not named Mr. Right for the wrong reasons. And that means basically including everybody in the conversation. This is the way our board, it seems to me, works under Angus. There is always a respect for difference. As chairman, that means he has to be a man of tireless patience. Yesterday he looked awfully tired at the end of the meeting, but he had given a lot of us a lot of time to express ourselves and repeat ourselves and express ourselves again and say the same thing for the 13th time. That's the kind of guy he is. Not moving us too fast, not rushing to a decision or a judgment. And I think that is something that all of us at the Land Institute need to keep reminding ourselves. There is a mission, but there's a process by which we reach that mission, in which we listen to people. We react to them even when we know they're flamingly wrong. But maybe there's something they say that might be right. And Mr. Wright knows that. He is a man of independent moral vision. He developed it long before he came to the Land Institute. But increasingly, it is one that we have all come to share. And on the board, I think he's had a tremendous impact in helping us think about our moral perspective as well as our science. It's a perspective that you're hearing more and more all over the earth as people, I think, come around to a way of thinking that Angus has been talking about for decades. I can't sum it up in a few words, but there's one sentence he wrote somewhere. I think it's in The Death of Ramon Gonzalez that more or less captures it. He talks in the same sentences about two concepts: the degradation of the earth and the exploitation of the poor. That's his sentence somewhere. And he sees these, I think, as two halves of the same problem. Two problems caused by the same forces. Now, I think Angus, I keep trying to call him Agnes. I have a good friend who's I've been writing to recently, but Angus. Where are you, Angus? Just a moment, I'm not finished. Angus, good Scottish name, I think understands that it's not easy to define those terms. After all, what is degradation? What is exploitation? And what are those forces? These are deeply complicated questions that need discussion, and not simply short-circuiting the discussion to rush on to think we know exactly what we mean. They're not easy to define, but I think Angus is pretty sure in his own mind, after much thought, about what those terms ought to mean. If they sound familiar to you, the degradation of the earth in the same sentence with the exploitation of the poor, well, it is all over the place these days. Lots of people are becoming aware that these connections exist. John Cobb just reminded us of, what's that guy's name, Pope Francis? What John was quoting basically sounds a lot like what Angus has been saying for a long time. I'm not going to say that the Pope was plagiarizing, but he might have been. I mean, after all, who is his speechwriter? Who is the Pope's speech? He's got a speechwriter. He's got maybe a whole team of them. And I look at Angus over here and I think, well, my God, he's always going to Latin America. He speaks a lot of languages. And when I look at him, I say, well, if you put a clerical collar on him and a brown robe, like a Friar Angus, or a black cassock, he would be my image, of a good priest, a good Latin American. I know he's a complete secular atheist, but I mean, put him in the right clothes. Who the hell is the Pope's speechwriter? Well, I've just given you some very good things to think about when he gets up here. And if during the next few minutes he's going to talk to us about what people will do for dirt, but if you hear anything that sounds like Latin, you know I'm right. Okay? Angus Wright, our chairman of the board. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Don, for that very overly generous introduction. And I always write these speeches that are very serious, and I always depend on something in the room to create silliness. And I think Don has just gone overboard. And I can tell you that the ghosts of my mother and father are spinning in their graves at a comparison of me to a priest. The last thing they would have wanted. And the last thing they could expect. I was just given a photograph of myself at a previous talk here by our friend Paul McKay, who was sitting over here. I always recognize him by his hat. There he is. There's his hat. And he and his wife do wonderful work through an organization called EPIC in Guatemala and Central America. And he gave me a picture that he'd taken of me at a previous time. And the thing that struck me about it, of course, I was really handsome. But then, other than that, was that I was wearing the same shirt. And I thought I should assure you that I do have others. But this is one of my favorite. So, and if you look at it carefully, you'll see it touches on some of the themes I'm going to talk about. So my subject is, what will people do for dirt? And I successfully summarized this in 4 sentences to Allison last night. And I intend to subject you to those 4 sentences, holding them in suspense, and with endless and relentless elaboration. And as a historian, I was thinking about it, historians always claim a kind of objectivity and keep their moral purpose low, but really we're scolds. Historians really provide us with very long-winded stories that tell us how to behave. Because our view of history inevitably informs what we are doing and what we should do. And thinking as a historian and thinking about the International Year of the Soil, which is really what I was trying to respond to when I thought about giving this talk, any historian thinking about that immediately thinks of all of the history that has been written of the erosion of civilizations as a result of the erosion of soils. And a great deal of that has been written. We have reviewed it many times at the Prairie Festival. We had a wonderful talk by David Montgomery, who wrote the book Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. And he reminds us of the classic work of George Perkins Marsh, who in the mid-19th century devoted himself to the history of ancient civilizations and the way in which they had been undermined and destroyed by the degradation of soils. And we take that with examples like Plato and Aristotle's talking about the ancient, long before they, destruction of the soils of Greece. We have throughout all of this literature examples from the history of Chinese civilization, and examples, some of the most famous are from the Mayan civilizations of the classical period, approximately 1,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. And in all of these cases, we parse out the theme of the degradation of soils from some much greater historical complexity, and we always have to end up admitting that if civilizations fall as the result of soil degradation, it's a very complex process that is not only about soils, it's about the complex interactions between resources and people in a way that is very nuanced and complicated. Having said that, I'm going to run roughshod over it, as most of the historians of this theme have done, and I'm going to leave out a lot of nuance, and I'm making some sweeping statements that I hope will keep you awake on a lazy afternoon. And I don't want to leave the topic of those who have gone before without mentioning Don Worster's classic work, The Dust Bowl, The Southern Plains in the 1930s, which brings all of this home to us, and which is one of the classic works of environmental history. But I'm going to look at this from a slightly different angle than we usually do. Now, most of the people who have treated this topic have talked about what I'm going to talk about today, but it's not what gets emphasized. It's not the angle that we speak about from the podium and so forth. And that is that, you know, these civilizations that fell partially as a result of the degradation of soils, wholly or partially, according to our interpretation, they weren't made up of just stupid, wimpy people who sat there and said, oh my God, the soil's going away. Well, what can we do? I guess nothing, you know. They were made up of intelligent human beings who were capable of recognizing and, to a considerable extent, diagnosing the nature of the problems, and they tried to do things about it. And so part of my theme today, sort of underlying the theme, is what have people done? What will people do for dirt? When they see it eroding away, what do they do about it? I'm going to use two broad examples for that. And because I think the important questions really have more to do with how societies have reacted to soil erosion, and that all the ingenuity of human beings and blossoming of specialized knowledge that's made possible by agriculture's bounty, all of that, what kinds of solutions have been tried, right? And if we look at any major civilization, we're going to see an extraordinarily rich repertoire of responses to the problem of the soil, right? And I'm just going to quickly review some examples from Mexico and Central America where I have some knowledge, but I want to really emphasize that were we to get, and we probably should, Peter Kenmore back up here, he could give us 1,000 times more examples from the world of Asia, or those of you who are out here who are familiar with Africa could give us similar repertoire from Africa. You name your world region, there is a wide repertoire of ways in which people have responded to soils, and there's also, or to soil degradation, and there's also a great deal of commonality in that, all right? But so let's just for a moment go to Europe, or to Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest around 1520. And these people were not only conquistadores, many of them were really superb writers. And they wrote a lot about what they saw. And their judgment, and remember that these were people who were themselves very close to the soil. Many of them had run off as conquistadores because they didn't want to find themselves behind a plow and drained out, washed away soils of the province of Extremadura in Spain, where most of them came from, right? So they were observers of agriculture, and they had strong opinions. And I'm not going to try to quote all these, but I'll quote a historian, John Richard, who I think has done a good job of summarizing their observations. An obvious determination, he writes, by the Spanish intruders was that the maintained landscapes of cultivation and settlement in Mexico were aesthetically pleasing, intricately managed, and manifestly prosperous. The pre-conquest inhabitants of Mexico had painstakingly constructed intensive, often irrigated systems of productive horticulture tailored for each of the major ecological regions, the coastal lowlands, the Piedmont, and the semi-arid, broad, volcano-surrounded basins of the high plateau. So successful were these systems of cultivation that the inhabitants clearly produced abundant and even surplus food for themselves. Ending the quote. Now, having observed that, the Spanish at that time kind of missed a couple of things that they were unable to appreciate about the situation. The first was that they were not able to understand how hard-won that particular moment of prosperity was. That soil degradation had contributed to various episodes of major social collapse in the previous 500 and 1,000 years of Mesoamerican history before they got there. And that much of what they saw and admired were solutions in an attempt to avoid similar events in the future. So they weren't quite attuned to how hard-won all of this was. Second, they really didn't take account, and at that early date there was no way they could have, of how disastrously the introduction of European grazing animals, the plow, disease, and European purposes and social destruction, so the dismantling of social systems would undermine everything that the Mexican indigenous people had accomplished. Let's just look at some of the things that they had done prior to the Spanish arrival. Let's go back to that point. First of all, they had developed a large portion of the crops that we all depend on today, right? And we all know corn above all. We think maybe about a third of all the human crops today were developed by indigenous peoples of the Americas, primarily in Mesoamerica and the Highland Andes, with probably Mexico being the area of most intense innovation. Well, we won't go through the whole list. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. And farmers and agricultural specialists, and we can say, yes, that they had agronomists. They did have agricultural specialists, educated and capable of producing documents that served as guides for agricultural practice, were able to classify soils into dozens of types and adapt cultivation techniques accordingly. They learned one of the most fantastic systems of cultivation that some of you may practice in your garden. I do from time to time. Very well known to most of us. It's not news, I think, to most people in this audience. The Three Sisters, or the Tres Hermanas, as it's called in Mexico today. My favorite Mexican restaurant is called Tres Hermanas. It always reminds me of this. And it's nice because it was founded by three sisters, so it's a pun. But maize, corn, and maize, beans, and squash, with the beans providing nitrogen fixation, the corn providing a stalk for the beans to crawl up, the squash providing weed suppression by its broad leaves, the combination of their roots forming a complex that tended to reduce soil erosion rates, and the three in combination providing an excellent nutritional foundation, as any good vegetarian knows. Right? But excuse me, I'm going to need some water. The Three Sisters were very far from a total solution, even though it was such an attractive technique that it was adopted all the way from the Iroquois down through the high Andes. So they did a lot of other things. They incorporated plant, animal, and human wastes into soils. They added inorganic soil amendments, sometimes that they mined. From the deserts of Sonora to the jungles of the Guatemalan Petén, they used small and sometimes large-scale irrigation systems that were often very ingeniously adapted to slopes and to the possibility of capturing silt and minerals as a function of the irrigation systems. These systems were so intricately designed in some cases that historians and anthropologists are still puzzling over the incredibly complex interrelationship between the development of these irrigation technologies and the development of the societies themselves, because the two are so clearly woven together. And they commonly planted nitrogen-fixing trees, as they still often do, into cropping systems, realizing fertility gains while also increasing field moisture retention and providing material for mulch and compost. They gathered forest debris and the algae, water, weeds, and water weeds, and aquatic organisms from lakes and rivers to spread across their fields or to compost and spread. They scoured the environment for nutrients. And one of my favorite examples, and that is found in practice in Oaxaca, southern Mexico, and other regions today, is the widespread use of the nutrient-rich debris cleaned out of underground nests by leafcutter and other ant species. Some of those species themselves being farmers of fungus, mushrooms, underground, and they have cleanouts. They have spring cleaning, and they bring the debris out, and this is a rich fertilizer. In addition, ant eggs are prized as fertilizers, right? And these have the advantage of being very dense nutrient sources that are relatively easily transported. Now, this may seem really incredible for us to think of these little ants as being a source of that kind of fertility, but if you've read any E.O. Wilson, he tells us that in tropical ecosystems, ants account for 25% of the body mass of all animals in the ecosystem. Okay? So this is no small thing. It's a lot of little small things, but an awful lot. But in contrast to those highly concentrated forms, most of what they did in fertilizing and in the other techniques we're talking about required immense, disciplined, highly coordinated labor. And we have to remember that they did it without draft animals and without use of the wheel. In one of the most productive systems, the Chinampas system, that when the Spanish came over the ridge and looked down into the Valley of Mexico and they saw before them this great city, which they estimated, and may have been right, was larger than any European city. It was comparable in any case. And around it were these great lagoons in little rectangles that were the Chinampa systems that provided most of the food that that great city needed, and that had the advantage of being able to be worked by canoes and transport immediately. If anybody's been to Mexico City and you've gone to the great Merced Market in the middle of Mexico City, the Merced Market was provisioned every day, every early morning, by canoes that left in the evening and moved up to that market. And that was the market of Tenochtitlan, and it is the great market of Mexico City today. But now it's trucks. And so that compensated somewhat for the lack of traction animals and wheels. And many historians and anthropologists have suggested that the massing, consistent application of human labor in delicately balanced systems of soil utilization account for, at least to a large degree, the highly stratified and authoritarian character of many of these societies. And many of these societies, like a lot of other highly stratified and authoritarian societies, were highly militaristic, and one solution to the problem of soils was sometimes to go get somebody else's. Let me just emphasize again that this is just a tiny, tiny peek into the repertoire of techniques that traditional peoples of Mexico used, and that it is that comparable examples and multiplied many, many times over can be found in all parts of the world, as I'm sure Peter, who probably knows as much or more about it than anyone we've had ever speak here, can tell us. Much of these techniques remain in practice today. But remember that the second big lesson that the Spanish conquerors couldn't appreciate was how much that system would be sent into tragic disarray by their own presence and by the introduction of European diseases, the plow, domesticated grazing animals, and the fact that the Spanish were after gold and silver first, and as they went out after it, they set much of the Mexican highlands to the exclusive production of things like mules and the provisioning of essentially slave mining populations and completely sent those systems into disarray, both ecologically and socially. And if you want a wonderful book about that process, you should read Eleanor Melville's superb book, A Plague of Sheep. And I've also treated some of this in my own work. So the big lessons I draw from this part of my talk are that, first, that human beings have been intensely aware of and struggling with incredible intelligence and hard work to deal with the problem of soil fertility for thousands of years. And second, that in spite of all of that, much of that knowledge and practice can be easily destroyed overnight, forgotten, or undermined as social systems are destroyed. What will we do for dirt? Well, let's go back to the beginning. One of the things we do as hunters and gatherers is we search for it. At that point, we're not thinking about soil, we're not thinking about dirt, we're thinking about animals and grains that we're harvesting from the wild environment. But where are those found? Well, they're found where there's good dirt. So even before we're practicing agriculture, we're essentially following the dirt, right? And we follow it out of Africa and into all of the continents of the world except Antarctica. But they didn't think much about dirt per se, probably, at least compared to agricultural people. But once we invented agriculture, dirt became a central concern. And when we did that, we did at least three other notable things. We almost everywhere began to make soil a degradable and therefore finite resource. And so we can think about those societies without a lot of people, even without a lot of people, running into the problem of never being sure if they had enough land. Secondly, agriculture allowed for the growth of specialized classes in societies whose members did not till the soil, but lived from the food produced by others. Among the new classes were priests, rulers, and soldiers. Third, we could store and transport large amounts of food. A devilish combination, as degrading soils combined with the people and resources to carry out large-scale organized warfare by which more soil could be acquired. It helped to have priests and politicians always ready not only to organize the warfare and carry it out, but also to provide us with fabulously intricate rationalizations for why we were doing it other than the acquisition of more wealth. Okay. I see you are getting that this has to do with the present. Thank you. Now, I'm going to skip another section here. But what we can say is that from the beginning, one of the main things that people will do for dirt is to kill other human beings and subjugate them. The desire for more land is the fundamental and most enduring cause of mass warfare, with all the evils it brings. Historian Timothy Snyder has recently reminded us that fundamental to what he calls Hitler's ecology was Hitler's view that the problem of soil exhaustion was so compelling and so poorly addressed by modern agricultural techniques that wars of expansion, such as the one he initiated, were an absolute imperative for the survival of peoples and what he saw as races. And when we see that, we can also remember that that perspective was hardly original. It was an ancient perspective in a modern setting. So let me pass through quickly the fall of Rome. We've dealt with that. And we go to medieval Europe, where people in medieval periods began a vast expansion, mostly towards the east, and in that process deforested much of Europe. They destroyed the population of the European lion, and it's very difficult to imagine this, but they also drove the hippopotamus from the River Thames, right? And the soil they gained remained fertile for centuries, both because nature had provided fertility through the process of biology and geology, the sort that we talk here all the time about, the Land Institute, and because European farmers, like those in Mesoamerica, developed a deep and clever repertoire of ways of holding off the problem of soil degradation and of maintaining to a considerable degree soil fertility. Let's wipe out a few more sentences or paragraphs here. But what we can see is that by the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans are beginning to get quite concerned about soil fertility. And they're beginning to respond to it in a lot of different ways, including by creating what they called scientific farming. There was also one of the conferences in environmental history that I attended with Don. There were some wonderful papers on the way Europeans became obsessed with producing agricultural teas that provided a condensed form of nutrients that could be applied to soils. And we see this ever-growing concern with the problem of soil fertilities in Europe. But it wasn't teas that saved Europe. It was the conquest of the great prairies of the world and the establishment of settler societies made up of European immigrants, which provided the fertility that during much of the 19th century had a great deal to do both with fueling the Industrial Revolution and the economic growth of Europe and with putting off the problem of European soil decline. Sugar and cotton were the first really important crops, but as time went on, we added more and more, and those of you familiar with the history of Kansas know that there was a time at which English people were greatly despised in Kansas because they were considered to be the source of the financiers who controlled the trade in wheat as the wheat was transported from Kansas in the Middle West to Europe. And so the original supposed purposes of God, glory, and gold turned into routine matters of commodity production. God was forgotten as we enslaved whole populations in Africa and brought them to provide these crops for Europe. And glory was, all glory was lost as we progressively destroyed the native populations of the prairies of North America, Argentina, Australia, South Africa, and did everything we could to seize that fertility and turn it to the purpose of Europeans and Europeans who settled on that land. By the 19th century, it was becoming increasingly obvious that one of the fundamental solutions to the decline of European soils would be the great fleets that could carry the grains, wool, and cotton of the New World to the Old. The fertility of newly cultivated soils could be transformed into food and fiber for the people whose soils were in steady decline. Now, having done all of that, they discovered bird shit. Greg Cushman at KU has written a wonderful book on guano in which he shows that the guano islands of the Pacific were so important that you can read backwards much of the history of the Pacific Rim and the framework for economic and social and political relationships on the Pacific Rim from the era of when it was being rearranged for the purposes of guano, which of course also involved the importation of 250,000 or so Chinese laborers under worse than slave-like conditions. And soon we discovered nitrate mines, and then soon we moved to discovering the Haber-Bosch process that allowed us to extract nitrogen from the air, which allowed us to create massive world wars and also to restore soil fertility around the world. But without the soils and the minerals of the New World, even the Haber-Bosch process would not have been half so meaningful. We have to remember that it was conquest above all that I think provided a solution to this ongoing problem. So I can see Don, I can just see him itching at the nuances I've left out here. And well, full speed ahead. So what will people do for dirt? Well, just about anything. They will apply their ingenuity, their labor, they will enslave others, they will subjugate and eliminate whole peoples, commit genocide. I really probably should have said, what won't people do for dirt? And the answer would have had to be, well, not much, right? The history of human civilization show us that we will do almost anything to hold on to the soil fertility that remains to us or that we think may become available to us. And eventually we invent modern agriculture, a lot of it based on the Haber-Bosch process. And we go into the whole story that we've told so many times here at the Land Institute of the way modern agriculture creates its own assault on the soils, while at the same time providing temporary solutions to it, right? Like virtually all of these techniques that I've talked about, ancient and modern. So if we'll do damn near anything for dirt, why not think about the idea that maybe we've been doing this the wrong way for several thousand years? And that we really maybe ought to try another way of going at it. And this is what Wes Jackson set himself to thinking in the 1970s, and trying to figure out, how could you rethink this problem? How could you come up with a genuinely different approach other than all of these other approaches that had been tried with respect to dirt? What would be another way to go at it? And he asked himself the question, well, how does nature create fertility? And he looked at the natural processes by which the prairie creates soil fertility. Right? And he said, well, what if we could create an agriculture that mimicked those processes? And that in the process of producing food, we conserved and built soil fertility. How about that? Might that not be worth trying? And I've said to many people, and I'm getting more public about it because I'm more bold about my conclusions now, but when I first got on the board here, I thought, well, give this idea a 1% to 3% chance of success. But I thought, if you can fundamentally change, if you have a chance of fundamentally changing the relationship of human beings to the planet Earth, ain't it worth a try? Even at 1% to 3%? Right? Given all the rest that we have lost to the problem of maintaining soil fertility, our decency, our honor, our relationship to other people, our labor, our ingenuity, all that we have applied to this problem, if we could come up with another way of doing it, maybe we could avoid all of those losses and those prices that we have paid at such immense pain for the human family. And now I think that we're probably going to do it. I think we're now way above 50%. I think it's going to happen. And if there is a good chance that it will, why in the world would we not invest millions and billions of dollars and the investment of the work of hundreds and perhaps eventually thousands of scientists and the thinking of other people about how this works into society and human law and human interrelationships and government, how it's going to change all of that? Why would we not invest a great deal in this possibility compared to all the pain and suffering and destruction that the old way has caused? Right? Why wouldn't we do that? I don't have any answer for why we wouldn't do that. I think we have to do that. and we have to give it the best try we possibly can, and I think we're giving it a good run here at the Land Institute. And so my plea to you is to support us in this work. You support us by your presence. You support us by your interest. We also need money, and we need your ingenuity, and we need your help in every way. I've been asked to mention that we are about to start a capital campaign for a new building. We're hoping people will investigate that. We'll be putting information out to you as time goes on. But what will people do for dirt? I would say let's do this and see if it works. Thank you very much.